This video will spoil everything about the game NaissanceE, which is free to play on Steam. If any of these categories of games appeal to you, including atmospheric, abstract, surreal, minimalist, indie horror, walking simulator, or platformer, then I strongly recommend you play this game before watching. If you're okay with being spoiled, then welcome to the video. NaissanceE, that's how I'm going to pronounce it from here on out. It was the second game I purchased when I got Steam in 2013, and I absolutely love it, so much so that I think it deserves its own video. I am the biggest fan of this game that I know, and I want to provide a bit of background for this video before we formally begin. Back in late 2015, I had a brand new YouTube channel and was consuming a lot of video game content, mainly via channels focused on doing Let's Plays. But during this time, I also really got into game analysis, interpretations, game theorizing, all of that stuff. You know, where you do the thing where you try to find the hidden story and the real reason behind what is happening in a game. As with many other people, I found this area of YouTube via the YouTube channel The Game Theorists, and since NaissanceE was such a mysterious and thought-provoking game, I eventually had the idea to make my own video theorizing about the game's true story. The result was 2 videos explaining my interpretation of the game cobbled together on the trusty and available Windows Movie Maker. I was convinced that they were my best videos I ever made for my channel up to that point. Alright, so I have the backlog of the original videos on my computer, and I just wanted to show you guys this because this cracks me up.
Greetings, comrades. Josco here, and welcome to a very special occasion that I would like to share with you. Today's video will be an in-depth analysis of the one and only...
I sound like I'm 5 years old. I don't know why that is. I don't know if it's something with like the bitrate settings or whatever. Because it was what, like 4 years ago? I don't think my voice dropped that much in that time. I don't know. It's just...
Greetings, comrades. Jessica here. Welcome to my little theory video. Yeah!
So yeah, overall, these videos didn't age too well just from a video making perspective, and I ended up taking them down later anyways. However, I still think that, especially since over the past few years I've continued to evolve my thoughts on the game and have found new games and game analysis videos since, my original thoughts about what NaissanceE is actually about should be shared. Except there's one problem about this theory that I crafted way back in the day, and it's that I don't think it actually holds up that well anymore. Over the past few years, I've become convinced that NaissanceE isn't actually a game that can be successfully interpreted as having a cohesive hidden story, and I think my interpretation itself has a lot of holes that I want to reflect on and point out. So what I want to do with this video is walk through my theory about what is really happening in NaissanceE and sort of analyze my thought process and do some self-critique now that I've been removed from it for a few years and have gained different perspectives in that time. First, though, I just want to talk about game theories in general. Theorizing about video games is something that I've always found to be really entertaining ever since I discovered it. I think it's because in a lot of ways it's really similar to the work that scientists do when trying to figure out how things work in our own universe, as well as the work that historians do when they try to piece together the events of history. Whether that be just trying to straighten out the order of events in a game universe that get all scrambled up across multiple installments in a series, or by attempting to discern a cohesive narrative or theme from games that are laden with metaphor and symbolism. There is a sort of empirical scientific process that hopefully guides your thoughts when you're doing this. And it's really cool seeing bright young minds being put to work trying to make better and better theories to explain everything going on in a game's universe. I have plenty of first-hand experience myself in this while being a fan of the Submachine games, which have had fans guessing about what is going on in those games for over 15 years. I don't know, I just have a fascination with the progress of knowledge on understanding worlds, whether that be our real one or a fictional one. For example, in school, I loved learning about models of our solar system and how we first thought that the Earth was at the center of the universe, and that worked for a bit until we realized we couldn't explain why the planets moved weirdly in the sky the way that they did. Then we came up with the idea of putting the sun at the center of a solar system, where Earth and the other planets spin in circles around the sun, and that answered so many more questions about the movements of the night sky. Then that was further refined when we devised a model that had the planets traveling elliptical paths, and it got even better with gravitational theory showing that the sun's movement is also influenced by the planets as well. To see this process of constantly refining our understanding of the world applied to video games, then, is just great. I love it. Now, this theorizing thing, though, really only works if there's actually a deeper story to be told, and if the story and game world itself don't have internal contradictions. It would be a lot harder to learn about our universe if the laws of physics and space-time that seem to govern it could be broken. The same applies to movies, too, which also make up a big part of media critique culture, just like games do. And when you have a piece of media that purposefully hides its inner workings from the audience, it's harder to tell if there actually is a cohesive story to find underneath all of the layers and obscurity that some games have. And to bring this back around, as I said before, I believe that Naissance doesn't actually have a concrete story with characters and specific events in it to find. I think based on the Steam description by the developer, it's left up to interpretation on purpose for everyone to attach their own meaning to and to get out of it what each person specifically puts in. And I don't have a problem with that at all. Games as art do not need to have a specific plot necessarily, they just need to be able to emotionally move the audience. And what Naissance lacks in a specific story, it more than makes up for in its general themes. There's a YouTuber named Jacob Geller who has a really good video on how the point of Naissance is its ability to make you feel uncomfortable, rejected, alienated, and otherwise unwanted by the inhumane game world. I suggest you all watch it, link in the description. Other games are also primarily theme-based, like Limbo comes to mind as a game about basically the brutality of death and the raw, near entertainment value of experiencing a world that's trying to outright kill you at every turn. Grease talks about grief and healing from it, and it doesn't necessarily matter who the main character is or what specific circumstances led to her grief. Inside is all about control, multiple levels of it, and I take it on good faith from the developers that it's not about any specific chain of events besides that, though with Inside I feel like there's still a deeper story that needs to be explored personally, but hey, what do I know? People have made theories on it, kinda poking at something more concrete, but who knows? Before we actually get to my theory, and trust me, we will get there, I just want to look at a few personal interpretations of Naissance that people have had. Obviously, most of these weren't shared with the intent of actually trying to empirically prove what's going on. Not everyone took this as seriously as I'm about to do, but I still just want to do a few surface-level evaluations. This is sort of your last chance to back out of the video and go play it for yourself before we spoil too much. This thread on Steam has a bunch of ideas. Some of these are almost pitifully simple, like saying the game is just a metaphor for life, or that the entire game is a dream or a simulation, which are interpretations that really can't be disproven in the sense that they're so vague that it's impossible for them to be debunked, I guess. One theory says that this game is actually Portal 3. I don't see it personally. I think whoever said that just happened to play a lot of Portal recently and the influence kinda just bled over. We're gonna talk about this later, actually. Other people, however, have made note of the fact that this game is inspired heavily by the manga called Blam, which features similar alien architecture that was built by an artificial intelligence that went rogue and created an entire planet full of buildings. Or maybe in a similar vein we find ourselves in a giant abandoned spaceship. Perhaps the creatures we find within, whether that be the pulsating clouds of cubes we find at the beginning and at the end, or the slug-like and spider-like forms we stumble across, these are all infestations of said spaceship. Then there are theories that this place is actually a giant purgatory or limbo, and maybe the ending of the game hints at a possible reincarnation of sorts. Now, people have attached a lot of metaphysical symbolism to different parts of the game in this respect. And finally, people have pointed to our protagonist's name, Lucy, being derived from the words meaning light and daylight, which ties into the game's heavy implementation of light and shadow as a mechanic. Though I'm not quite sure how this ties into a specific story. So there's many angles that people have approached interpreting this, but none seem to fit really well. There is one interpretation, however, that I think is a very strong one, and that is one of birth, or childbirth specifically. Some people point to the title itself, which is formed from the French word naissance, meaning birth, and then to the end of the game when Lucy is running away from the host, where the red waves that sort of swim in her vision and her jumps between the collapsing structures before spilling out into the final white light simulate labor contractions before delivering a baby. Other features in the game hint at possibly being symbols for pregnancy, and I took this theory and I ran with it. So a big part of my interpretation of this game focuses on fleshing out how it's a metaphor for pregnancy. But also, my unique spin on this comes from the game not only being a metaphor for a developing pregnancy, but also because I think Lucy, whoever she is a victim of sexual abuse that is learning to heal from a rape that she experienced. Yeah, I told you that this video wasn't going to be all sunshine and rainbows. So let's just get into it, and I'm going to walk you through the basic story in a way similar to how I originally told it, and then we'll analyze it afterwards. So this is a delicate subject matter. I should point out that this comes from my understanding of how sexual trauma works, which is very limited, and the research that I did in order to flesh out my points is definitely that of an amateur and not of a professional. I sort of cringe at this more than a tiny bit when I look back on it, but I promise it'll turn out to be an educational experience in the end when we get to the analysis. First, we should take note that our movement in this game is broadly divided up into 3 parts, one where we mostly move downwards, such as in the first chapter, and in the second chapter where we move down the big well. The second part is moving horizontally, whether that be in the large expanse at the bottom of the well, via the dark blocks and the overhead catwalks, or in the deadly air vents in the third chapter. The third part is upwards, the upwards movement, where we fly up the final air vent and ascend the long and arduous staircase. These can map onto the 3 trimesters of pregnancy, especially when considering that in the final trimester, the baby flips head down inside the womb, and this mirrors the flipping of direction that we primarily experience between the first and third parts of the game. The inciting incident of all of this happens right at the beginning, where Lucy is running away from her abuser and gets pulled into the pit as the abuse happens. Then the floor drops out from underneath her and delivers her to the start of the game, completely broken and at a complete loss of security. The room she lands in is barren, the bright light offering no comfort at all and leaving her feeling totally exposed. She has no choice, however, but to walk directly into the darkness in front of her. This is part of what is described as the acute phase of post-trauma, where the victim is immediately trying to gather themselves and their world is very small as they try to take care of their basic needs. Lucy needs help, and thankfully she does get it pretty soon after in the form of the tiny light that guides her through the tutorial, like a friend who helps walk her through the next steps that she has to take in order to take care of herself. Soon after, Lucy stumbles across a room that periodically fills with a bright light and a mechanical noise, and her vision is blurred from the intense heat. It's like a giant stone oven, and this room symbolizes the intense heat that the sperm must survive in order to fertilize the egg to conceive the zygote. After escaping this room, Lucy learns to run. This running mechanic, where you regularly have to click to maintain your breath, is an interesting one, and not everyone who's played this game is a fan of it. That being said, I think it's pivotal to understanding the metaphor of breath being used as power to slowly overcome trauma and provide a point of stability that Lucy can rely on. It might be easier for the game to just allow you to run indefinitely and not have to think about it, but here I think it serves to remind players that the healing process must be constantly reinforced in order for it to work. It's an active process, not a passive one. Later on, Lucy finds herself in more tight, claustrophobic rooms lit by lights that provide a short segment of the way forward each. Now, these lights will be found in multiple sections of the game, and it's very easy to treat them as welcome friends of sorts, because that's exactly what they are. They are friends who are helping Lucy bit by bit to readjust. After this, the next room is very dizzying, involving stark lighting contrasts and dangerous pitfalls, which makes it one of the more disorienting rooms in the game. This matches with the tendency for victims of sexual trauma to experience bouts of dizziness and confusion. There is also a double helix shape formed by the cubes in the middle of this room, alluding to the DNA of the eventual child to come, slowly starting to form. The next room involves a puzzle using a moving light to jump across multiple platforms, and it's very easy to slip and fall and have to repeat this section over and over again. Now, this is a friend who's trying to get Lucy from one place to the other, but is maybe pushing a bit too hard for her to handle at the moment. The game does offer some help if you fail at this too many times, but with the way that the lights turn on suddenly without any warmth, and the way the extra platforms slide out, it seems like it's more out of annoyance than out of a genuine want to see Lucy succeed. This could reference the feelings of being a burden that many abuse victims feel, or the general reserved unwillingness that society sometimes has to provide immediate resources to those who need it. We now reach the section of the game labeled in the save files as Poozygate, which I always assumed was short for Puzzlegate since we have 2 puzzles to solve here. One of the puzzles tests Lucy's intelligence, with manipulating light to advance forward, and the other tests her physical platforming and timing abilities, the two skills that the player uses most in this game. But it should be noted that this area's layout consists of two long hallways with a sphere of light on each end that has to be moved back to the central area before being embedded in the central area's walls. This then opens the gateway to the next area. And I don't think it's too much of a stretch to see that this area is in fact a physical metaphor for the female reproductive system, which hopefully you've had adequate education about. The female reproductive system contains two fallopian tubes that carry eggs from the ovaries to the uterus, where the fetus grows before being delivered through the cervix and the vagina. Now, based on how this all pans out, I think it's very possible that Pussygate instead means, Pussygate. Bit crude, I know. This doesn't mean that the entire pregnancy ends right here, it's just a sign of things to come as Lucy deliberates on her future. Then we enter the section called the Big Well, and this is the beginning of the next stage of Lucy's healing of trauma. After being initially healed from the trauma, she now has to be reintroduced to the world via what's known as the underground stage, or the outward adjustment stage. With her sense of security being impacted by the sexual abuse, the world is now extremely big and scary, and seemingly hard to navigate with no clear path forward. Lucy has to stick to the outskirts, out of the spotlight, and tread very carefully, as it's extremely easy for her to slip and fall, as both she and the baby are very vulnerable in this stage. In this section and throughout the game, Lucy's slips and hard landings are met with cries of pain, yet she always tries to cut them off and stifle them as a way of not showing weakness. This notion of taking things one step at a time while facing the looming threat of the rest of the world through a green-tinged haze mirrors the persistent feelings of nausea and dizziness that accompanies both post-traumatic stress as well as morning sickness. The sticking close to the walls also helps symbolize the zygote implanting into the uterine wall so that it can start to properly develop. This world she finds herself in has familiar architecture, but it's not familiar enough. Her senses are dulled by the trauma, and some sharp-looking shapes protrude from the walls, signifying danger. There are some familiar places that poke through to her memories: a bar and a strip club, a kitchen in an apartment, a dorm room with a computer and a TV, though maybe this one provokes memories that are a bit too painful as she finds herself floating, increasingly unable to move as the controls slowly shut down. It's time to leave before she gets trapped there forever. Amid all the confusion, there is one event that points to some potential positivity, which is justice for the rapist, whomever that may be. Lucy enters the inner workings of the courthouse, which is one of the few structures in this world easily recognizable by its 4 columns situated on its facade, as well as the prison cells that lie behind it. But the case and investigation is not straightforward, and the details are very messy and confusing. Rooms lie everywhere with paths that loop on themselves, or ones that lead seemingly nowhere. Whether the perpetrator is eventually convicted or not, it doesn't really matter. Lucy still eventually leaves the matter behind with still a long way to go. She continues to heal and thankfully comes across some friends in unlikely places that eat into the dull blandness and coldness of the world around her. But she still does not have a chance to let her guard down, as one wrong step can easily still cause her mental state to collapse. Now, as she enters the second trimester of her pregnancy, Lucy's world stabilizes a bit, both inside and outside of herself. She's now not on a downward spiral, but rather starting to bottom out. Everything is continuing to move along as she learns more about the pregnancy and what to expect from it. This expands her knowledge of her own body and the vast amount of processes that happen in the background, symbolized by the huge open spaces with thousands of offices in the Great Plain. While she might slip into spells of depression as she walks on the dark ground with hard-to-make-out stairs, she periodically comes across some sculptures that help her begin to recover her creative spirit. More of her friends continue to support her and help clear her way forward. She eventually decides to see a support group, shown by this light surrounded by a group of cubes, but it's hard for her to muster up the strength to join, and she sort of has to stumble her way into it. When she does join, however, it provides beneficial for her to help face her demons in her everyday life and manipulate her thoughts in order to progress. Finally, as she ascends to the catwalks, she comes to the next major realization of her life, that as time goes on, the fetus continues to develop, and that means that she has less choices going forward that she can make with her life. The game begins to mirror this as the paths Lucy can take are much more constrained, and the game no longer feels like an open-world experience as she enters the tunnels and the air ducts. Now, as she deals with the trauma not only of her abuse, but that of motherhood itself, her feelings shift to episodes of fear and anger that put her in mental states that are in a very delicate position which she must carefully balance. What does it mean to carry her rapist baby? Does she even want to? She visits a hospital as a matter of course, symbolized here by the aqua-green color of the room, and she is confronted with the ultimate decision on whether or not to keep her baby. Her environment demands that she provides an answer to this question. The path to the left leads to a life full of color and possibility for the baby, and the path to the right is achromatic, offering harsh, unfeeling messages of what will happen if she decides to abort the fetus. And she can, if she wants to, but then that leads to the end of everything. So Lucy decides to press on with the pregnancy as she enters the reorganization stage of her recovery. But as the baby becomes more and more developed, she must be even more careful not to harm it. She has to take care of herself too, as the baby continues to leach nutrients from her system. As the baby weighs more and more on her conscience, she starts to have nightmares. Many nightmares, with visions that she cannot explain or understand. But she definitely understands some of them, notably the one where she revisits her initial fall in the moments after the rape, again, and again, and again. Eventually, though, these also die off as she moves into the 3rd trimester and she plans to deliver her baby. She visits the Electric Canyon, where on the other side lie the final days of her pregnancy and where all of her choices she made, all of the previous choices in the last 9 months, must converge. She can also see the pathways that others took to get to this point as she continues to get help from those who went through similar experiences, but it's still frightening. It seems impossible that this can happen, and yet it must. After seeing no other way forward, she bites the bullet and plunges into the darkness, climbing the long staircase and hoping that she can come out the other side. And she does. The baby is now inverted in the womb, just as Lucy is concerned about now rising to meet the occasion instead of falling and bottoming out. She experiences moments of clarity, moments of color as she revisits in her mind bits of the journey that she's gone on, but the time has now come for the labor to begin, and to fully commit to it, as she knew she always would have to do. The last chapter of the game is twofold in its heavy symbolism. As we initially discussed, this is the part that easily maps onto labor, with the red tinges and the racing to jump to the final door filled with light, but it's also about being fully confronted with the fact that Lucy is about to deliver her rapist's baby. And let me just break my storytelling aura here for a little bit to point out, like, we all see it, right? The host is literally a giant dick. Like, it's a penis. It's right there. Lucy is delivering this baby as the memory of her rapist threatens her mental state one last significant time, and she finally gives birth at the end. This signifies a new beginning for her and her child, one where she's not completely healed, but instead it's a time and an opportunity for her to start something new. So yeah, that's my theory, and I sat on it for like a year or two at least, and I was thinking to myself, well, you know what, this is not perfect, but I think it sticks to the wall better than the other theories do that you might want to throw at this game. So now let's talk about how much it sucks. Again, we're keeping in mind that this game is supposed to be up to interpretation, so whatever works for you works for you. That's fine, but in the context of trying to be as skeptical and rigorous as possible, there's a lot in this theory that really actually isn't supported that well. And the points that I'm about to make are points that you can consider for yourself as well when hearing someone offer an explanation for something, whether that be for a game theory or a scientific discovery or observation or, I don't know, even like the latest conspiracy theory that you've read about on the internet. First off, one of the biggest things to look out for are just hard facts and observations which contradict the model or interpretation that someone has proposed. Naissance has several such observations that actually contradict what I said. I posited that the game can neatly be broken up into 3 parts based on general direction of movement, which is down, horizontal, and up. And while the first part is primarily downwards moving, the second and third parts aren't really as clear-cut, as there's plenty of staircases and ladders to ascend in part 2, and part 3 has a great deal of its own horizontal movement in the desert and the final boss run, and not to mention the huge, downward endless dive that we take in chapter 6 when we do decide to jump over the edge. So that weakens the whole trimester argument immensely. Another huge one that is a bit more subjective, but which I think is still very relevant, is the role in which the background music plays in painting the emotions of each scene. I think the music is very integral to how you experience this game, and I have not talked about it at all yet. While there are some scenes in which the music definitely is there to enhance the tension and the creepiness or otherwise a chaotic insanity of a scene, the music exists in other places that I've painted as foreboding and intimidating to a rape victim, and it just doesn't feel that way by what the music is telling me. Like, the soundtrack in the well and the big plane under the well is something that I would describe as almost like reverent. It has this anthemic quality that draws me to be in awe of the environment around me, rather than putting me in a position, where I feel like oppressed. There are other examples besides this that you could probably tease out, but I want to point out just a very tiny one. In the very beginning of the game, the first light sphere that you come across, which is supposedly supposed to be your friend, it not only moves up to a platform that you can't access at some point, but it actually laughs at you after doing so, like it's teasing you for not climbing higher. Take a listen. This motherfucker! If these light spheres are supposed to be our friends guiding us back onto our feet after trauma, that's like directly the opposite of how you'd want our friends to act in this situation. Another thing to watch out for, and I think I did this throughout my theory because it's very easy to do when you're building a narrative based mostly off of symbolism and metaphor, is when someone's explanation seems like it's more of a story held together by a lot of presupposed glue instead of a set of logical conclusions. What I mean by this is the way I told the story in particular is very story-like rather than a more formal proof. Storytelling in this context relies more on appeals to emotion and embellishments and whatnot that sew together the main events, oftentimes with a great deal of presumption that the events leading up to what you actually see in the game are of course the only way that it could have happened, because the result that we see obviously couldn't come from somewhere else. To ground this in reality, as an example to relate it to a popular conspiracy theory, the fact that the logo of the United Nations contains a projection of the Earth is obviously because the UN actually knows the Earth is flat, and therefore is using the map that's used by a lot of people who believe the Earth is actually flat and not a globe, and they're just choosing to rub it in our faces. Now, this doesn't rely on any evidence, of course. Flat earthers use it to support their argument because they presuppose the entire reason as to why the projection is part of the logo. Similarly, in my theory, you could argue that stumbling across the strip club in the dorm room is obviously because Lucy is revisiting parts of the world that stick out in her mind. This presupposes that said events are part of her history in the first place, and assume the intentions due to that. The story involved in lengthy conspiracy theories often comes across as convincing to an audience, not necessarily because the facts taken at their face value are convincing, but because the story acts as a sort of colorful glue that holds all of the parts together and gives a semblance of a cohesive plot even when there's not one to be found. One could argue that my presupposition that the bulk of events that I describe that relate to Lucy's state of being comes more from the connections themselves rather than anything that the game objectively points to. The third thing to watch out for when evaluating an explanation is whether or not the explanation has an ability to explain things that other theories specifically can't, because otherwise it's probably not much more valid than any other theory that's similar to it. If we think about the rape trauma theory, and we do assume that much of the game is Lucy healing from said trauma, how much of the things that we've attributed to this healing process could be because of experiencing other types of trauma? What about if someone came back from a war after being injured as a soldier, or what if someone just got assaulted or kidnapped without any sexual abuse? People dealing with different causes of post-traumatic stress tend to go through similar steps of recovery to some degree, whether that be the immediate regrouping and seeking for help, or the wider reintroduction to society, or the wrestling with emotions and finding support groups that Lucy also did. What if Lucy is a drug addict seeking help instead of being a rape survivor? What if the Deeper into Madness chapter is depicting nightmares but as a result of drug abuse or as a result of serving in the military? If you were to go back through my explanation and things that I attribute to the healing process, there's really not that much that the rape survival theory really uniquely tackles, I think. The apparent connection to childbirth seems to be the easy additional factor, I guess, if you assume that that holds. Maybe the courtroom also factors in, but everything else, like describing the symbolism of the well being the uterus, for example, is more just me trying to make as many spurious connections as possible. And finally, let's talk about environmental influence, which is the factors and material conditions that affect how people see the world. People like to draw conclusions on things based on what they already know, and through what they've experienced. I experienced this a lot in the submachine theorizing community, where it was apparent that sometimes someone would try to explain the structure of that game's universe because they were taking a math or a physics class, and they thought that something they learned in a recent lesson could maybe make a good model. I mentioned at the beginning that someone thought that Naissance was a depiction of Portal 3, And this sounds like the type of thing you'd probably hear from someone who recently really got involved in the Portal series, obviously. I do this myself as well, outside of video games. For example, I'm currently working on a project where I'm using my prior knowledge of chemistry and the structure of the periodic table to make new ways to visualize music structure that I don't think anyone's considered before. So in this sense, environmental influence is not a bad thing in itself, it's more of a two-edged sword. It can lead you to develop new perspectives to solve certain problems like I'm trying to do here, but it can also route you on a path that will lead to nowhere if you're committed to fulfilling the application of that prior experience to the problem at hand, and it can sort of narrow your vision. In my case, thankfully, I didn't draw on any direct experience of assault in reference to making this theory, but it's worth pointing out that around the time that I made this theory, I was in college and was helping my friend deal with sexual assault that happened to them. I don't quite know which came first, but it is definitely significant. And, of course, if nothing else, being a terminally online young adult male would at least kind of, explain this, probably. So yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say in regards to what I thought was going on in this game. When I initially made this theory, I did a lot of research, clicking around websites and checking out resources in order to try to understand more about what it's like to survive sexual assault. But I, of course, only have a limited perspective on this topic to begin with. So don't take it to heart, and hopefully I didn't ruin this game forever for you. I don't really think of the theory that much when I revisit Naissance anymore, as I focus more on the themes elaborated on, again, in Jacob Geller's video, great video, and the game's experimental nature with utilizing light and breathing as mechanics, that sort of thing. But, hopefully, either way you learned something new about games and theorizing if nothing else. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and anything that I should consider or anything that I missed. And thanks for watching.